The man known to history as Chiang Kai-shek was born on the 31st of October 1887 in the town of Shiko in Zhejiang province in the eastern region of China, on the other side of Hangzhou Bay from the city of Shanghai. His father was Chiang a moderately prosperous merchant. His father before him had found success as a salt merchant, but Jiao Tsung expanded his business interests into selling rice wine, rice, vegetables and other commodities. Chiang's mother was Wang Cai-yu. She and Jiao Tsung had 4 children together, of whom Chiang was the third.
This video is brought to you by Supremacy 1914, a free online PvP strategy game in which you can use military tactics such as those used by Chiang Kai-shek perhaps. You can choose a real country to lead during World War I and fight up to 500 other players in real time in games that can take weeks to complete. Use many different units to build your army, such as cavalry, tanks and planes, and declare war on your neighbors or forge alliances with other players. Choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. For me, the best part is the long-term strategy, which gives real-life immersion, allowing engagement and realistic gameplay. You can play Supremacy 1914 on PC and Mac, as well as mobile. You get an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Offer only available for 30 days. Don't lose any time.
Chiang's life was shaped by political and social processes, which were already underway when he was born in 1887. A half a century earlier, China's long-held policy of cutting itself off from Western influences had come to a crushing end when Britain went to war with the Chinese in an effort to, amongst other things, force it to open its ports to the sale of opium from British India. In the decades that followed, China had gone through political and social revolutions as its culture was bombarded with Western ideas. Similar processes were underway in neighboring Korea and Japan, though Japan adapted more quickly and by the 1880s was emerging as a regional power with a Western-style government and military. In contrast, China was being pulled between 2 opposing factions. One consisted of traditionalists who wanted to maintain the style of imperial government that had prevailed for millennia, and which had been represented by the Qing dynasty of emperors who had ruled since 1644. The others wanted to create a republic, although even amongst these there were competing factions who wanted a conservative republic based on traditional values such as Confucianism, and those who were inspired by radical socialist thinkers from industrial Europe, whose writings were being read in intellectual circles in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. The battle to reconcile these competing outlooks was the backdrop against which Chiang grew up and lived. When he was 8 years old, Chiang's father died. His mother was left largely destitute, and in later years, Chiang would speak of being left virtually orphaned at this time. Although she lived until the early 1920s, it was a difficult childhood thereafter. In 1906, he determined to take charge of his life by heading to Japan, the most modernized nation in the Far East, one which had recently managed to defeat Russia in a brief war, to acquire military training within the Japanese army. There he spent time at Shinbu Gakko Military Academy in Tokyo. The academy was a place of learning for many Chinese students at the time, and was a hotbed of political radicalism, with many of the students looking towards the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in Beijing and the modernization of China so that it might emerge as a revitalized power similar to Japan. One of the radical groups here during Chiang's time was a branch of the Tungmenghui, or United League, a secret society that had been founded back in 1905 by one Sun Yat-sen, a Chinese philosopher and revolutionary who had spent time in the United States and had returned to Asia determined to achieve what he called the 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and welfare. Inherent in his political philosophy was a determination to overthrow the Qing dynasty, which he not only perceived as being archaic, but also critiqued as a dynasty of the Northern or Manchu Chinese. Chiang would become intrinsically connected with Sun Yat-sen and the political movements he led for the next 20 years. Between 1909 and 1911, Chiang continued to serve in the Japanese Imperial Army, while also fostering his associations with Chinese revolutionary movements. He only returned to China in the late autumn of 1911 when the outbreak of a revolution, known to posterity as the Xinhai Revolution, led to a major political crisis for the Qing dynasty government. The imperial government had been weakened already through the succession of a 2-year-old emperor, Puyi, in 1908, and without strong leadership and little desire to maintain the imperial regime throughout China at large, the imperial system collapsed in a matter of weeks. On the 1st of January 1912, a new Republic of China was brought into being, bringing the imperial system, which had dominated the country for over 2 millennia, to an end. Sun Yat-sen was appointed as the provisional president of the Republic. By then, Chiang was active in the politics of the city of Shanghai and moved between there and the capital of the new republic, Beijing. In the autumn of 1912, he was involved with Sun Yat-sen in the creation of the Nationalist Party, a political successor to the Tungmeng Hui. While the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 and the creation of the Republic of China were momentous events in China's history and its modernization, they did not bring a stable democracy into being. In the 1910s and into the 1920s, the political landscape was a chaotic one, in which warlords who had formed part of the old imperial system carved out their own principalities in the provinces. Additionally, Sun Yat-sen, Chiang, and the nationalists were soon outflanked in the country's constitutional politics by the Progressive Party that was formed in 1913. This led to what is known as the Second Revolution, a period in which Sun Yat-sen and his followers refused to acknowledge the authority of the Beiyang government in Beijing, led by Yuan Shikai, an old Chinese general who was seen as being tainted by his associations with the Qing dynasty, and who briefly tried to restore the monarchy in 1915. There was, in effect, a form of civil war throughout China during these years, although it was a very chaotic state of affairs rather than an organized conflict between competing entities. Chiang was a bit player in all of this, a mid-ranking figure within the Nationalist Party, one who acted as a liaison for Sun Yat-sen between Japan and Shanghai, traveling over and back between the two. But few people who knew him during these years would have predicted his rise to national prominence in years to come. As these momentous events were playing out in China's politics, Chiang's personal life was taking on a complex shape as well. Back in 1901, Chiang had been married when he was just 14 years old, to a woman named Mao Fumei, a 19-year-old acquaintance of the family. This was an arranged marriage which was entered into for financial reasons to aid the family following Chiang's father's death several years earlier. Their tumultuous relationship reflected this unorthodox start. Chiang followed the practice of concubinage, a Chinese tradition whereby he took mistresses that were almost like second or third wives. One of these was Yao Ye-chung, a woman he began a relationship with in 1912. While later in 1921, he started a separate relationship again with Chun Jie-ru, a 15-year-old girl that he had first met a few years earlier when she was either 12 or 13. These overlapping relationships have led some accounts of his life to state that Chiang technically had multiple wives, though he divorced Mao Fumei in 1921 when his relationship with Chun Jie-ru became more formalized. Only one biological child, a son named Chiang Ching-kuo, born to Mao Fumei and he in 1910, was born of these relationships, although Chiang also adopted a second son, Chiang Wei-kuo, the illegitimate son of an associate of Chiang's in Japan in the mid-1910s, who gave up the child for fear of disgrace. Chiang's political career shifted considerably in the late 1910s and into the 1920s. In 1919, Sun Yat-sen, along with other Chinese revolutionaries such as Chiang, formed the Kuomintang, a new political party as a successor to the Nationalist Party, a name which translates as China's National People's Party. This new iteration of the party was based out of Guangdong, in the south of the country, and was committed to armed struggle to overthrow the government in Beijing and unify the country under a strong centralized leadership. It was willing to accept the help of any group which would further that goal, including the new communist regime which had seized power in Russia late in 1917 and which was gradually winning a civil war there to establish the Soviet Union. In the autumn of 1923, Chiang was sent by Sun Yat-sen on a mission to Moscow to organize additional aid to the Kuomintang and to review the Soviet military system. Chiang was not entirely convinced that the Soviet system was suitable for China, though Sun Yat-sen is claimed today as one of the forefathers of the Chinese Communist movement. As a result of Sun Yat-sen's death in the spring of 1925, the Kuomintang would come to be identified as the power opposed to communism in China. With this, Chiang began to exercise increasing control of the Kuomintang and move the nationalists in a different ideological direction to what Sun Yat-sen had planned. The event which really catapulted Chiang to the forefront of Chinese politics and made him a pivotal figure in the history of modern China was the Northern Expedition. This was a military expedition which the Kuomintang commenced in the summer of 1926, under his military leadership. Its name is derived from the fact that the nationalists headed north from their base in the southeast of the country to campaign against the warlords that controlled the provinces in the north and against the government that operated from Beijing. When it commenced in July 1926, Chiang had less than 100,000 men under his command, a moderate force given the sheer size and population of China. A series of swift victories in the months that followed saw Chiang wrest control of the provinces of Hunan, Jiangxi, and Fujian by the end of 1926. His forces swelled as he did so, and by the time he began his attacks on Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927, he and the rest of the Kuomintang commanders had 500,000 followers. With such an immense force, they managed to secure control of central China and established a provisional government at their new capital of Nanjing in the late spring. From here, the Northern Expedition would continue through 1927 and into 1928, eventually unifying most of the country under nationalist rule after a decade and a half of division and anarchy since the promulgation of the Republic back in 1912. But it would be an all too fleeting victory. Chiang was the central character in creating the split in the nationalist movement, which led to the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War even as the Northern Expedition was still underway. The tendency today is to view the Kuomintang as a right-wing organization, and there is little doubt that it became so over time under Chiang's leadership, albeit with socialist elements to it even during the Civil War. However, in the first half of the 1920s, it was a much more complex and fluid political movement, one with a left wing and a right wing, as exemplified in Chiang's own mission to the Soviet Union late in 1923. These divisions became more stark in the first months of the Northern Expedition, as the left wing, led by Wang Jingwei at this time, formed a solid block of opposition to the right wing, which was emerging under Chiang in the closing months of 1926. This left wing was increasingly dominated by communists who were close to Russian military advisors and politicians who were active in China. When Chiang led the campaign to Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927, the left wing formed a splinter faction that tried to retain control of the city of Wuhan, which had briefly served as the Kuomintang's headquarters in the final months of 1926. Thus, even before Chiang secured Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927, the left wing under Jingwei had already begun to splinter at Wuhan. While divisions were rife already by 1927, Chiang and his conservative allies within the nationalist movement spurred on the drift towards civil war in the weeks after capturing Shanghai and Nanjing by violently suppressing communist movements and groups within the captured cities, a campaign of repression termed the White Terror. The worst of this came in Shanghai on the 12th of April 1927, when Kuomintang military units acting on Chiang's orders began purging the city's communist groups. Similar incidents were replicated across the cities under nationalist control in the weeks that followed, and by the late summer it was clear that the communists would have to oppose the Kuomintang leadership if their ideological goals were to survive. Hence, the Chinese Civil War began on the 1st of August 1927, when left-wing nationalists began an uprising in Nanchang, a date which is typically identified in Chinese communist history as marking the formation of the People's Liberation Army. The movement was led by figures like Wang Jingwei, Zhu De, and Zhou Enlai at this juncture. Mao Zedong was a minor leader within the initial uprisings who would only rise to the fore of the Chinese Communist movement in the 1930s. The period around the commencement of the Chinese Civil War was one of further unrest in Chiang's personal life, though it also led to lasting stability in his romantic life. Many years earlier, back when the Kuomintang was being formed in the late 1910s, he had met and begun a quasi-relationship with Sung Mei-ling, the daughter of Charlie Sung, a prominent Chinese businessman who had spent time in America in his youth, hence his anglicized name. The Sung family became prominent in Chinese business and political circles thereafter, and Mei-ling's sister, Qing-ling, had been the wife of Sun Yat-sen for the last decade of his life. Mei-ling's family had warned her off a relationship with Chiang back in the late 1910s, owing to his wife and concubines and the fact that he was over a decade older than her. But in the mid-1920s, they began spending time together. In 1927, Chiang divorced Chung Jieru and ended his concubine relationship with Yao Yechung in order to marry Mei-ling. Thereafter, he remained a broadly monogamous husband. This final marriage of his would last for the remainder of his life, and Mei-ling became a prominent figure within the Kuomintang in her own right. They would not have children, though Mei-ling may have suffered a miscarriage in 1928. From 1927 onwards, even as the civil war between the nationalists and the communists was raging, Chiang and the other Kuomintang leaders were overseeing a period of Chinese governmental reform and expansion, known as the Nanjing Decade, so termed because the capital remained at Nanjing even after Beijing was seized. While many criticisms could be leveled at the nationalists, there was no denying that this was a period of progress in a number of important respects. The economy expanded, principally through a cooperative movement which revolutionized the cotton industry. The number of factories increased massively, while there was nearly 4 times as much length of modern highways in China by 1936 as there had been in 1927, as a nationalist road-building program was initiated. Access to education expanded greatly and literacy levels increased. Things as simple as an effective postal system and an operational banking system emerged after decades of sluggishness in introducing such modern concepts into China. Yet there were issues. Regional famines and food shortages persisted. At the same time, while Chiang was the most powerful figure within the Kuomintang, he was far from all-powerful, and numerous factions had power ebb and flow between them in the decade following the Northern Expedition. It was clear by the time the Northern Expedition was achieving its goal of unifying much of China in 1928 that the nationalist movement was not exactly a homogeneous ideology, and various factions within it were now descending into a civil war. So what did Chiang actually stand for as a leader of the right wing of the Kuomintang? Where the communist left-wing branch was modern and socialist in its outlook, Chiang looked backwards to a more traditional view of Chinese society, one rooted in Confucianism, the philosophical religion that had shaped so much of Chinese society for millennia. He also incorporated elements of conservative imperialist traditions into his political philosophy. In this sense, he was profoundly different to Sun Yat-sen as well, a figure he claimed to be the political successor to, but who had been a modern liberal who admired figures like the British liberal philosophers John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill Sr. and Jr., as well as Theodore Roosevelt in the United States. These views of Chiang were most clearly expressed in the 1930s in the New Life movement, a civic campaign led by the nationalists which sought to promote Neo-Confucian values and a form of Chinese corporatism, exemplified in the Blue Shirt Society, a Chinese version of the fascism sweeping Europe in the 1930s. This raises questions as to who Chiang himself was. Much like the political movement he led, he was a bundle of contradictions. On the one hand, he presented himself as a stalwart conservative and upholder of Chinese traditions, set within a more modern China. But on a personal level, he could be erratic, violent, and oppressive towards those around him. On occasion, this resulted in him physically attacking members of his staff. Despite his support for upright behavior in public life, he was incredibly corrupt and fostered such corruption in the Kuomintang generally. These contrasting approaches were perhaps most clearly seen through his sons. His adoptive son, Chiang Wei-kuo, was sent to Germany and ended up a junior officer in the German Wehrmacht, taking part in the Nazi annexation of Austria, while his biological son, Chiang Ching-kuo, spent many years in Soviet Russia. The one thing that can be said without equivocation is that Chiang was an ultra-nationalist. One American military commentator referred to Chiang's one major publication, a book called China's Destiny, as a Chinese Mein Kampf. Such was its xenophobic portrayal of people beyond China's borders. Another thing that is undoubted is that Chiang was a reasonably effective military commander. In the course of the late 1920s and the early 1930s, he very nearly won the Chinese Civil War. By the end of the 1920s, he and the nationalists had successfully managed to wrest control of virtually all of eastern China, where the great cities of the nation lay along the coastline from the communists, isolating the communists in regions like Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei and Shanxi provinces towards central China. By then, Mao Zedong was emerging as a new leader of the Chinese Communist movement, though it would be the 1940s before he became preeminent. The communist movement very nearly didn't survive that long. In the autumn of 1933, Chiang's armies began an encirclement of the communist position in Jiangxi, and over the space of a year-long campaign very nearly wiped out the communist movement in China. It only remained alive as units of the Chinese Red Army broke through the nationalist cordon late in 1934 and began what has been immortalized in Chinese communist propaganda as the Long March to Freedom. The movement remained alive into the second half of the 1930s, but there is no doubt that prior to Japanese intervention in China from 1937 onwards, Chiang and the Kuomintang were on the cusp of complete victory. Late in 1936, Chiang faced the greatest threat to his own life in many years. On the 12th of December that year, he was in the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province in central China to review a military detachment when he was taken prisoner. Chiang had traveled to Xi'an in the first place to review the troops and raise their morale here, as there had been issues with divisions in the region being unwilling to fight the communists. The issue ran much deeper, and in reality the communists had infiltrated the army here. As a result, on the 12th, soldiers stormed the complex where he was staying and took him captive. In Nanjing, the government was in disarray when news arrived. Meanwhile, the communists sent Zhou Enlai, a figure who would rise to become the second most powerful politician in communist China in the 1950s, to negotiate with Chiang. Over a course of a week or so, Zhou and he came to an arrangement whereby Chiang would be released on condition that he would commence peace negotiations once back in Nanjing, and that they would then combine to resist Japan's expansion in the Far East. With this, Chiang was released on the 26th of December, after 2 weeks in captivity. He returned to Nanjing and did order a ceasefire, but the nationalists were deeply divided into 1937 about how to proceed regarding the communists in the aftermath of the Xi'an incident. The Xi'an incident pointed towards the spectre that was now haunting China from without. Japan had modernized so effectively by the 20th century that it was determined to become the preeminent power in the Far East and the Western Pacific. Having conquered Korea decades earlier, in 1931 the imperial government invaded the Manchuria region of northeastern China and formed it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. A wider war was avoided through Chinese reticence to engage with Japan at that time, while the nationalists and the communists were mired in civil war. But in the summer of 1937, the Japanese invaded China again, this time occupying the major cities of the east. Beijing and Shanghai both fell quickly, and Nanjing was captured in December 1937, leading to mass atrocities in the nationalist capital by the Japanese in the weeks that followed. During the Rape of Nanjing, as it is termed, upwards of 200,000 people were murdered and tens of thousands of women were raped. Chiang had eloped with his government and divisions of the Kuomintang to the city of Chongqing, further inland in central China, which the Chinese resistance to Japanese occupation would establish as their capital for years to come. The outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War presented a problem for both Chiang and the leaders of the communist movement, like Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. they would not continue to fight with one another while also trying to resist the Japanese in eastern China. An uneasy peace was accordingly patched together for the duration of the conflict, however long it might last, against the occupying power. An additional benefit of this was that while the Communists could acquire aid from the Soviets in Russia, Chiang and the Nationalists had favorable ties with the British in India and Burma, as well as the United States, which was already anxious by 1938 and 1939 about Japanese expansion in the Pacific, a sphere which America considered absolutely vital to its economic and national interests. Both Chiang and his allies and the communist leaders were in no doubt, however, that as soon as Japan was defeated, the Civil War would resume. It would be many years before that occurred. From 1938, a bitter struggle commenced, with the nationalists and the communists controlling much of the west and central regions of China, while Japan was largely content to occupy the economically more important west and south of China, where the great cities of the country lay along the course of the Yellow, Yangtze, and Pearl rivers. That the Japanese did not press westwards and attempt to conclusively defeat the nationalists and the communists was in large part because their interest was drawn elsewhere. Japan desperately needed oil if it was to have any chance of besting the United States in a war. The nearest large supply of this was in Southeast Asia, around the Dutch East Indies, and also British wells in Burma and around Borneo and Brunei in the East Indies. Supplies of oil, steel, and other resources needed for warfare were also prerequisites for Japan to be able to defeat Chiang and his armies in central China. So when the US cut off supplies of oil and steel to Japan in the course of 1940 and 1941, it left the Japanese with no option but to either risk a war with the US or else abandon its expansionist policy. The regime in Tokyo chose war and attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941. It was the salvation of the Chinese cause. Within a year, the Second World War had turned decisively against Japan and its main ally, Nazi Germany, and with America's economy transformed to focus exclusively on the conflict, war material began arriving to the Chinese in ever greater amounts in 1942, 1943, and 1944. Chiang held the office of Premier of the Republic of China in the Chongqing government for most of the war period. He had held this office periodically during the 1930s, though not without interruption, while from April 1938 he would serve as the Director General of the Kuomintang until his death nearly 4 decades later. Therefore, while there were other rivals for power within the nationalist government during the Nanjing Decade, the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 allowed Chiang to consolidate his control over the government. Given this, he should be viewed unequivocally as the individual who was responsible for the prolific corruption of the nationalists during the wartime period. Enormous sums of money were embezzled by the Kuomintang officials during the late 1930s, and through the 1940s, much of it being funding sent by the Americans and British to support the war effort. Most scholars agree that Chiang was not personally guilty of excessive corruption himself, but he turned a blind eye to it. Notably the huge sums of cash stolen by the former Minister of Finance and head of the Chinese Central Bank, Kung Xiangxi. Kung was married to Chiang's sister-in-law, Sung Ai-ling, and he was unwilling to stop he and his wife from siphoning off tens of millions of dollars into American accounts. They would later leave China after the war and live in luxury in Beverly Hills, with wealth stolen from the Chinese state during the war. Kung and Ai-ling were just the most glaring example of this pilfering of the government coffers. Chiang did little to stop corruption proliferating at every level within the nationalist apparatus in the 1930s and 1940s. It is widely accepted today that one of the reasons why the Chinese communists were able to build support in these years and finally emerge victorious in the Civil War was owing to public apathy about this enormous level of corruption. Because of his position as Premier of the Republic of China, and also owing to the fact that the Chinese, both the nationalists and the communists, were receiving the bulk of their military aid from the British and Americans through India and Burma, Chiang was the paramount figure when it came to diplomacy between the Chinese and the Allies during the Second World War. For instance, Chiang was the third senior-most figure at the Cairo Conference in November 1943. Next to US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was not present. Here he pushed for a massive campaign into the Burma region, which would strike at the Japanese positions there and to the southeast towards Singapore, a project which would pull Japanese resources away from China and allow for American bombing of Japanese military targets within eastern China. Roosevelt was immensely supportive of the Chinese position and even agreed in principle to an injection of $1 billion of financing for the Chinese at the Egyptian conference. The Americans were also interested in the possibility of the Chinese overseeing Indochina after the war, being uncomfortable with the colonies of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia returning to French colonial rule once the Japanese were defeated. This was the high watermark for Chiang's diplomacy though. In the course of 1944, the American general in charge of the China-Burma-India Theater, Joseph Stilwell, became profoundly disillusioned with Chiang and the nationalists and their corruption, believing their embezzling of money had largely caused the fall of the city of Changsha to the Japanese in June that year. Stilwell was eventually replaced, but American faith in Chiang and the nationalists withered away nonetheless. The fall of Changsha was one of the last major victories for the Japanese in China during the war. By the second half of 1944, the war had swung definitively against Germany and Japan in Europe and Asia. The American economy had now been entirely transformed and directed towards the war effort, and men, aeroplanes, tanks, ships and armored vehicles poured into the Pacific Theater every day. In the spring of 1945, the Chinese advanced into southern China towards Guangdong. The intention had been to campaign north thereafter and retake Nanjing and Shanghai in what would have been a carbon copy of the northern expedition 2 decades earlier. But before these plans were ever initiated, the United States dropped the atomic weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945, leading to Japan's surrender a few weeks later. With this, the war came to an end in China, along with the Eastern Front in Russia and Eastern Europe between 1941 and 1945. The Chinese theater had been by far and away the most deadly theater of the Second World War, with between 15 and 25 million people being killed here through combat, Japanese atrocities and several famines between 1937 and 1945. Despite this, peace with Japan did not bring peace to China. Within weeks, both Chiang's nationalists and the communists were preparing for the descent back into the Civil War, which had only been on hiatus for as long as the Japanese occupied eastern China. By 1946, the Chinese Civil War was back in full swing. However, where the nationalists had been close to victory back in the 1930s, they were now much more evenly matched. Furthermore, while Moscow was willing to support Mao's Red Army as much as necessary, the Americans were seeking a way out of the war in the Far East and sent the Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, to China in 1946 to try to broker a peace, a sign of their wavering commitment. The nationalists were dealt a further major blow in 1947 when the administration of President Truman in Washington began drastically curtailing the amount of financial aid that it was providing to the Kuomintang, having tired of the endless corruption of Chiang's government. Chiang himself was elected as President of the Republic of China in 1948, following the promulgation of a new constitution, but within months he was threatening to resign following major military losses against the communists. The last year of the Civil War, from mid-1948 onwards, was characterized by a growing rivalry between Chiang and his vice president, Li Zhongrun, over the management of the government and the gold and dollar reserves at their disposal, even as the communists captured new towns and cities every month. When Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell in April 1949, it was the beginning of the end. Thoughts now turned to the island of Taiwan. Early in 1947, an incident occurred which was to have a bearing on China's future and in particular on Chiang's legacy. It happened well away from the center of political power in the cities of eastern China. The episode occurred on the island of Formosa, better known today as Taiwan. This was a peripheral part of China, one which had been controlled for half a century between 1895 and 1945 by the Japanese. In the aftermath of the war, the Chinese government had taken it back over, and a governor, Chiang, was appointed to oversee the island. The local population soon became disillusioned with the Chinese administrators and the Kuomintang rule, perceiving the nationalists as being as corrupt as the Japanese had been brutal. Heavy-handed policies culminated in February 1947 in protests over the sale and supply of tobacco. This all boiled over on the 28th of February in an insurrection which was brutally suppressed by Chiang and the nationalist garrison, with authorization from Chiang. The death toll on the February 28th incident is a point of major contention in Taiwanese history, with some claiming that as many as 25,000 people were killed, though other modern analysts argue the figure could not have exceeded 10,000. Whatever the death toll might have been, it has colored views of Chiang's legacy in Taiwan down to the present day. The February 28 incident would not have become as central an episode in Chiang's career were it not for the fact that his life would become so entwined with the island shortly afterwards. By 1949, the situation on the mainland was desperate for Chiang and the nationalists. In January of that year, he stepped down as leader of the Kuomintang and was replaced for a time by Li Zhongrun. He remained central to military planning and in the months ahead oversaw a gradual withdrawal of nationalist forces from Nanjing, Chengdu and Chongqing, and other cities and towns southwards towards Canton. Aware that they could not hope to resist the Soviet-backed communists on the mainland, Chiang and the other nationalist leaders now began preparing to evacuate the mainland and pull their forces back to the island of Hainan in the South China Sea and Taiwan, with the latter being the focus of the retreat. Chiang and the others realizing that the communists would find it difficult to take the island stronghold, particularly since the United States would aid the nationalists here and still had huge military forces stationed in the Western Pacific since the end of the Second World War. Thus, in the course of the autumn and early winter of 1949, hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops and personnel began evacuating from the mainland to Taiwan. When the trickle of individuals who had already fled here since 1946 to avoid the fighting that was taking place in China proper is taken into account, it is estimated that 2.2 million people relocated from mainland China to Taiwan between 1946 and early 1950. Having overseen this massive operation over the course of several months in late 1949, Chiang and the other leaders of the Kuomintang arrived in Taiwan and began establishing it as a rival Republic of China, even as the Communists were solidifying the People's Republic of China's hold over the mainland. The island of Hainan was overrun by them in the space of a few weeks in the late spring of 1950, ensuring that the nationalists were now confined entirely to Taiwan and some small island chains which lie around the larger island of Formosa. Taipei was established as the capital of the Republic of China on the island, and Chiang was quickly confirmed as the new president of the Republic. Such was the international situation at this stage in the Cold War that the Republic, despite being confined to the island and having lost all of the mainland, continued to be recognized by the Western powers as the legitimate Chinese authority, and the ROC, the acronym for the Republic of China, held a position at the United Nations from which the People's Republic of China was excluded for the next 20 years, a major boon to Chiang and his followers following the disastrous end to the Chinese Civil War. One of Chiang's first tasks on Taiwan was already underway from the middle of 1949, when the first steps had been taken to turn it into a nationalist stronghold. This began with the imposition of martial law and was soon expanded into a campaign to crack down on anyone who might be opposed to the new regime, especially anyone remotely connected to the communist movement. Much like the wave of anti-communist attacks launched by the Kuomintang back in 1927 during the Northern Expedition, it has come to be known as the White Terror, a campaign which technically lasted until the lifting of martial law through two measures in 1987 and 1992, but which was carried out most brutally in the early 1950s. In those early years, tens of thousands of Taiwanese people were imprisoned, while 3,000 or so were executed. Undoubtedly, some of those who were arrested and even executed were opponents of the regime, but like all such campaigns of state terror, huge numbers of people were punished excessively for only minor associations with the dissidents, while others still were entirely innocent of any crime. Many of the purges were personally commanded by Chiang against the navy and army, where hundreds or dozens of people were arrested at a time, ostensibly to root out communist sympathizers, though often in reality to remove any potential rivals to his rule. By the time the White Terror ended, it is believed that as many as 140,000 people spent periods imprisoned. The severity of the White Terror on Taiwan in the first years of the establishment of the nationalist government was not entirely unjustified. The communists on the mainland had not simply forgotten about the Kuomintang after Chiang led his people and armies to Taiwan in 1949. Mao and the other leaders of the People's Republic were determined to retake Taiwan, as much for the purposes of destroying a rival Chinese polity as for the actual strategic and economic value of the island itself. They had an opportunity to do so in 1949 and early 1950, at which juncture the United States probably would not have made any efforts to stop a communist invasion of Taiwan. But following the outbreak of the Korean War in the summer of 1950 and Chinese intervention in support of North Korea the following October, the US made it clear it would not look kindly on any efforts to attack Chiang's nascent nation. Nevertheless, in 1954 and again in 1958, the People's Republic began bombing some of the smaller islands in the Straits of Taiwan and seemed to be inclined to launch an invasion. On both occasions, President Dwight Eisenhower, who remains the only sitting American president to have visited Taiwan, when he did so in 1960, affirmed himself to be a staunch ally of Chiang Kai-shek, having the US Senate agree to the Formosa Resolution early in 1955, whereby US aid in defense of Taiwan should it be invaded was affirmed, while in 1954 a very direct threat was issued to Beijing that if Mao's government moved to invade, the US would consider employing its nuclear arsenal against China. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese, who would not acquire nuclear capabilities themselves until 1964, backed down. It wasn't all a one-way street when it came to plans to resume the war between the nationalists and the communists. Chiang also developed plans to invade the mainland in the 1950s and into the 1960s. One of these involved the training of elite bands of insurgents by the American CIA, under the terms of the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, the plan being to send these to the mainland to operate alongside anti-communist elements there. A 1956 plan envisioned the mobilization of approximately 750,000 troops to invade the mainland, an enormous force in any other corner of the world, but perhaps nowhere near enough to invade and conquer mainland China. The most elaborate scheme was Project National Glory, or Project Guoguang, an initiative around 1960 and 1961 that aimed to take advantage of the chaos which had been unleashed across China by the Great Leap Forward, as Chairman Mao's efforts to have China become one of the most industrialized nations on Earth resulted in a catastrophic famine that killed tens of millions of people. The plan was shelved when the United States refused to sanction it following the debacle of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in April 1961. Any hopes of invading the mainland were fully abandoned from the mid-1960s, once the People's Republic acquired a nuclear arsenal. In 1954, the first presidential elections were held in Taiwan, following the flight to the island in 1949. This was not an open election, but instead just over 1,500 delegates to a National Assembly determined who would serve as president for a term of 6 years. Chiang garnered 97% of the vote, hardly surprising given the dominance of the assembly by the Kuomintang. A similar system was employed in elections in 1960, 1966 and 1972, with Chiang winning overwhelming victories on each occasion. As president, he ruled Taiwan as a military dictatorship. It came with the usual features one would expect of this. The White Terror continued in a slimmed-down manner. A secret police cracked down on open expression of political views and cultural liberalism, and the cult of personality he had first fostered on the mainland continued. But there were some advances. Aware that the excessive corruption the Kuomintang had engaged in back in the 1930s and 1940s had been substantially the cause of their losing the civil war, Chiang attempted to reform this element of the nationalist government. Moderately socialist policies were also pursued, and a middle class was cultivated through progressive taxation. Economically, Chiang was a protectionist in the 1950s, seeking to build up indigenous industries and self-sufficiency, though that would change in time. Diplomatically, Chiang fostered relations with the United States as Taiwan's closest ally, while also seeking close ties to Japan, a country which emerged quickly from the disaster of the Second World War to become an economic powerhouse of Asia. To a much greater extent than back in China in the 1930s and 1940s, Chiang promoted a cult of personality on Taiwan from 1950 onwards. There were reasons for this. Firstly, it was, to a much greater degree, the unchallenged dictator of Taiwan after the flight to the island in 1949, whereas he had rivals for power within the nationalist movement back in China in the period from the mid-1920s to the end of the 1940s. This was also a period of growing dictatorial rule and personality cults in Asia more broadly, with figures like Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee dominating North and South Korea from the late 1940s onwards. In Taiwan, this took the form of images of Chiang in public spaces, encouragement of people to keep images of the leader in their homes, and also the erection of civic buildings in honor of Chiang and his family. This cult of personality would persist long after his death and continued to be promoted by his son and his widow. It has only gradually been dismantled in Taiwan since the 1990s. Despite Chiang's initial economic protectionism in China and in his first years of his rule over the Republic of China's island home, his quarter-century rule there saw Taiwan begin to enter into an economic miracle. In the 1960s and 1970s, the country experienced annual rates of GDP growth of nearly 10%. Much of this was driven initially by a commitment to creating small and medium-sized cooperatives that mass-produced goods that required little technological know-how or industrial capacity to make. For instance, beginning in the 1960s, Taiwan began to mass-produce umbrellas. By the 1970s, 3/4 of the world's umbrellas were made in Taiwan, and this was just one of many such products that the country cornered the market in. From there, it began to build technical expertise and use both American and Japanese financial aid and direct investment to begin developing more sophisticated products. For instance, the last years of Chiang's time as head of the Republic saw the first plants opened to manufacture semiconductors. Today, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan is worth over $100 billion, and the island produces 20% of the world's supply. Earlier critics suggested that the Taiwanese economic miracle happened despite Chiang's protectionist impulses. But in 1959, his government had adopted an economic reform plan that prioritized market liberalization and foreign investment. The early 1970s brought a shift in international relations which was profoundly negative for Taiwan and the position Chiang had tried to establish for his nation on the world stage ever since 1949. Throughout the 1960s, Western countries, led by the United States, had been under growing pressure from Moscow and Beijing to recognize the primacy of the People's Republic of China at the United Nations. In 1961, the communist government was admitted to the UN, meaning there were now two nations within the organization that claimed to be the legitimate government of China. In the years that followed, several Western nations shifted their stance to recognize the People's Republic as being the de facto government of China, while many of the leading non-aligned countries in the Cold War, such as India, also pressed China's case. Then finally, in 1971, the United States shifted its stance following a visit by the American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to Beijing. As a consequence, late that year, a UN resolution effectively expelled Taiwan from its position on the Security Council and admitted China as the recognized Chinese government. Then US President Richard Nixon undertook a state visit to China in February 1972 to begin normalizing relations. In the end, the reality of the People's Republic controlling all of mainland China and the economic benefits which would accrue to the Western world by normalizing relations with Beijing proved decisive factors, and most countries withdrew official recognition of the Taiwanese government. Chiang was an aging man by the time that the Western powers began changing their diplomatic stance to acknowledge the People's Republic as the power that represented China on the world stage. Already into his 80s by the 1970s, he began to suffer from numerous ailments during these years, notably kidney problems and heart issues. A heart attack preceded his death from kidney failure and pneumonia at 87 years of age on the 5th of April 1975, over a quarter of a century after the retreat to Taiwan. A month of mourning was declared in Taiwan, both before and after his state funeral on the 16th of April. A huge tomb was created to house his remains. The Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, which is located in central Taipei next to the National Theatre. Today, a library and museum commemorating his life and the history of the Republic of China are inside the hall. He was succeeded as president by Yen Chia-kan, who served out the remainder of Chiang's 5th term. When fresh elections were held in 1978, Chiang's son from his first marriage, Chiang Ching-kuo, was elected as the new president. He gradually oversaw a loosening of Kuomintang and military rule, and is generally credited with beginning the transition to a democracy after his father's dictatorship. Chiang left behind a contested legacy. On the one hand, his life's work had ensured that an alternative version of China, one very different from the People's Republic of Mao Zedong, remained alive on Taiwan, yet its position was weak at the time of his death, and the Western world clamored to recognize the People's Republic and in the process turned their back to some extent on their Taiwanese allies. Both China and Taiwan have changed greatly since. Mao's near successor, Deng Xiaoping, set China on a course of economic liberalization and further rapprochement with the Western world. What has developed since, through the Chinese economic miracle, is a country which remains communist in the barest sense, in reality being a capitalist state with elements of a command economy, one where an autocratic government reserves the right to intervene substantially when its interests are threatened. Taiwan has become much more democratic since Chiang's time, and despite his position as father of the nation, he is ranked poorly as a leader there on account of being a quasi-dictator. Nevertheless, while Taiwan has become a democratic nation, and China a pseudo-capitalist one since Chiang's time, the tensions between the two nations and China's desire to reincorporate what it perceives as a breakaway province have not gone away. Quite the contrary. As anyone who keeps an eye on world politics will be aware, tensions have been escalating in the Straits of Taiwan again in recent years, and China's desire to annex Taiwan will be one of the most important flashpoints in the growing rivalry. Chiang Kai-shek was one of the most important individuals in the history of modern China. For a period of half a century between his rise to the top of the Kuomintang following the death of Sun Yat-sen in the mid-1920s, down to his death in 1975, he was at the forefront of the nation's politics. For exactly half of that period, he was the leader of the nationalists on the Chinese mainland, a period which saw him lead the Northern Expedition, then nearly achieve victory over the communists in the early 1930s, only to have the Japanese invasion occur from 1937 onwards, followed by the Second World War, a resumption of the Civil War in 1945, and final defeat in 1949. Few individuals live through such historic events, let alone are at the center of them continuously for several decades. The encore was a quarter of a century as head of the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan. And yet, despite being unquestionably the most significant figure in the history of modern Taiwan, his legacy there is very contentious today. This in many ways reflects his career. He was an individual of enormous ability, though fatally flawed, with the corruption and the brutality that the Kuomintang became synonymous with in the 1940s, ultimately allowing the nationalists to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in the Civil War. What do you think of Chiang Kai-shek? Was he a Chinese patriot who could have steered China on a far better course if he had led the nationalists to victory in the Civil War? Or was he a corrupt military dictator who simply looks good in retrospect by comparison with Mao Zedong? please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Supremacy 1914 is a free online PvP strategy game set up during World War I. Choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. You get an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Offer only available for 30 days. Don't lose any time. Click the link in the description, choose your country, and fight your way to victory.